Well, welcome everybody to this Friday's meeting of the Silicon Valley Speechwriters Association and Fripp VT. We're very pleased to have a special guest with us today. We're going to be at the intersection of Hollywood screenwriting, speechwriting, and storytelling. And there's no better person to lead us on that journey than Michael Hauge, our main guest. Michael has been one of the film industry's top script consultants and a story expert for more than 30 years. He now coaches professional speakers and corporate leaders, as well as screenwriting, helping them transform their stories and their audiences using the principles and methods of Hollywood's most successful movies. And we're not kidding. Michael has consulted on films starring, among others, Will Smith, Tom Cruise, Reese Witherspoon, Julia Roberts, and Morgan Freeman, and has presented lectures and workshops to more than 70,000 participants worldwide. According to Hollywood legend Will Smith, no one is better than Michael Hauge at finding out what is most authentic in every moment of a story. So, for today's conversation, it's my pleasure to now welcome my good friend, Ms. Patricia Fripp.
Thank you, Ian. And Ian, of course, is a great blogger, great speech writer, and a past president of the local chapter of the National Speakers Association. Now, if you are watching this live in Northern California, at the end of our event, we need you to go to nsanc.org and find out about the fabulous program I will be presenting at tomorrow. Stand Up, Speak Out, and Cash In. Thank you for my Fripp VT, my virtual users meeting. This is our user meeting, which we, for this special event, are combining for the second time with the Silicon Valley speechwriters. As the Silicon Valley speechwriters meet virtually, you don't have to be in the Silicon Valley to be part of the group, and Ian will tell you about that later. So meanwhile, part of the Fripp VT team is Paul. Paul will be handling any back-end challenges, problems, and making everything work. He will handle the polls and read the questions that you pose for Michael. So Paul, take it away and then introduce our first poll.
Hello, everyone. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a chat window. In this chat window, you'll be able to ask your short, specific questions that will be answered during the call. We will also be running polling questions throughout the call. When the polling question appears, select your answer, click Vote, and then click on the Chat tab to return to the chat window. And we're going to start with our first poll. Do you write speeches primarily for yourself or others? And you'll have about a minute to answer that.
Well, good. Thank you. And that is a very easy poll, yes or no. And Michael, the answers are coming in. They change at the moment as they respond. We're probably already in. However, Michael, I'm never going to forgive you unless you tell our friends about your first phone call with Will Smith.
Sure. First of all, let me thank you both, Ian and Patricia. It's an honor to be here. I've been looking forward to this. It's going to be fun, and I always enjoy an opportunity to share the stage with Patricia. We've done that a few times, and it's just a joy. So, yes, let me tell you how this came about. It was some years ago, and I'm working away as usual. And at the moment, at the time, I think I was kind of feeling sorry for myself just because I felt like, you know, I'm on the outside of this Hollywood circle more than I'd like to be, as we all do, and wondering what was going to come next, and the phone rings. And I answer, and it's a woman. She says, "My name is Tracy, and I work for Will Smith." And I said, "You mean Will Smith, Will Smith?" And she said, "Yeah, that's the one. And Will wants to know if you would be willing to take a look at a script. He's currently shooting a movie called I Am Legend. They're struggling with the ending of the movie. They wonder if you'd take a look." And I said, "I think I can find the time." So they email me the script. I compose all my thoughts, write it all out, send it off. And I was thrilled because, as I said to my wife, look, the biggest movie star in the world wanted to get my opinion, and I thought that was it. So a couple days later, Tracy calls again. She said, "Hi, Tracy. Will wants to know if you'd be willing to talk to him about your ideas about the script so he can get more feedback from you." And I said, "I think I can find the time." And I said, "But before you go, tell me, how does Will know me? I mean, what made him track me down?" And she said, "Well, I know he has your book, but I think the main thing was he watched your video called The Hero's Two Journeys." So I thought, cool. And we set up the meeting. Time comes, his minions call the levels of gate guardians until finally Will's on the phone. So I said to him, "Look, I know we're going to talk about the movie and the script, and you want to do that, but first I got to play the fan for a minute." And he said, "Sure, go ahead." And I said, "I should tell you that I lecture a lot about romantic comedies, and one of my all-time favorite romantic comedies is Hitch, because it is such a great example of what I consider to be all the essential components of a romantic comedy, structurally and character-wise and so on." And he said, "Well, I should tell you that all the time we were working on that script, we kept asking ourselves, are we doing what Michael Hauge said we should do in terms of how these two people are connecting at the level of essence?" So I thought, score! And that was one of my favorite Hollywood days, because I'd never before had the experience that anyone said, because of something I said or used as an example, that's why my example turned out to be the way it was. So that was a nifty day.
Well, that is very exciting. And Michael first told us, Darren LaCroix and me, that story at dinner. And being the modest, unassuming person that he is, Darren and I had to force him to tell that story, and I trust you enjoyed hearing it as much as all our audiences have. Now, Paul, tell us the answer to the poll. How many people write speeches primarily for themselves?
85% write speeches primarily for themselves, and 15%, of course, write speeches for others.
All right, good. Well, Michael, let's go right into it. What is the most valuable lesson that speakers and speechwriters can learn from Hollywood?
To me, it's this, that good stories, great stories, are built on the idea of desire and conflict. A good story is not just a story about a person in a situation, a person living their life or dealing with whatever they're dealing with. It's about someone who has some compelling desire, something that they're desperate to achieve or accomplish, and then must face seemingly insurmountable obstacles to achieve that goal. So when you're looking for possible stories to tell in the speeches you write or the speeches you give, what I would strongly recommend is look for situations about yourself, if you're talking about yourself, or about others, where that character, that hero of your story, wanted something specific that has a clearly defined endpoint, and then had to overcome major obstacles to achieve that. Because your goal in telling a story is always to elicit emotion. Stories can do an immense number of other things. You can persuade people to take action, you can move them to tears, you can get them angry, whatever it might be, but you can't do any of those things unless your story first makes people feel something. And emotion grows out of conflict, not desire. Desire just moves a story forward. It's the obstacles the characters face that are going to create the emotional moments. So that's my strongest piece of advice probably in this entire webinar, is look for desire and conflict.
And I have heard you say, Michael, that we don't go to the movies to watch, say, Tom Hanks fall in love with Meg Ryan. Can you finish that thought?
Yeah. We don't go to the movies, actually we don't read novels, and we don't really listen to stories in good speeches as observers, just to imagine something. It's not about watching the people on the screen fall in love. We want to fall in love. We want to stop the serial killer. We want to find the buried treasure. We want to save the day in some way or win the love of our life. And you create stories where we empathize sufficiently with the hero of that story that we become them on a psychological level. Good stories are participatory, not just observational. We immerse ourselves in them if you as the storyteller are doing your job and really creating that kind of emotion.
And in stories, we always talk about that stories have a hero. Now, my Fripp VT users know that what we teach them is you can't be the hero of all your stories. However, you have a slightly different definition for the heroes in the stories you talk about in movies.
Yes. By hero, all I mean simply is the protagonist, or the main character, if you want to say that. It's the character we're rooting for to accomplish whatever this goal is they want to accomplish. What I do not mean by hero is someone who is heroic. Most good stories, in fact, almost without exception, good stories are about everyday people plunged into extraordinary circumstances. Even if they're superhero stories, they still have everyday traits that are going to be challenged by the goals they form. What I define as a hero is someone who has the potential to become heroic. It is in the course of the story that they will be given that opportunity, and if they find the courage to be heroic, then they earn the goal or the obstacle, the object that they're going after in the story. So it's that transformation into hero that you're looking for, not someone who starts out great. And if, as you said, I have heard people give the advice about speeches, never make yourself the hero of the story, and I disagree with that. Because by my definition of hero, any story about yourself where you start out facing some dilemma in your everyday life, or some opportunity or something bad or good happens that's going to move you towards a goal, you should be the hero of that story. It's fine. What you don't want to be is a character in the story who is superior. You don't want to make yourself a know-it-all and so on. But if you started out at square one, struggle to achieve some goal, and create enough empathy with you as a character, as the hero of your story, I strongly recommend that kind of story.
So Michael, if I can just ask Fripp. So Michael, what you've just said is very applicable to the business world, not just Hollywood, right? You could have any presenter in the business world. They've all got goals that they need to achieve. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Before the webinar, many of you should have received or a link to a couple of speeches that we were going to use as examples. If you haven't had a chance to look at those yet or didn't receive those, they're going to be available after this podcast is over. There'll be a link and so on, so you can look at those, and I'll fill you in so you'll know what I'm talking about. But the first of those stories was, they were both autobiographical speeches. And the first one, it was by an ex-criminologist named Karis Kubrin. This was a TED Talk she gave. And I will just tell you how she began the speech. She said, "A few years back, a defense attorney contacted me to ask if I would be an expert witness in a case involving an aspiring rapper who had been charged with making a terrorist threat. This would be my first official expert witness case, so I jumped at the chance. And as a professor of criminology as well as a rap music scholar, I could hardly wait to share my expertise." So she is immediately making herself, not the rap artist, the hero of the story. And as it develops, we'll see how that works. But notice when she introduces herself, she does a couple things. First of all, she tells us what her everyday life was before this happened. It's very brief. She just says, "I'm a professor of criminology and a rap music scholar." It doesn't sound like anything extraordinary. That's just what she does. And then she revealed what I call the opportunity, the first new thing that happens. She gets this call that she is wanted as an expert witness, but she adds something very important when she says, and I honestly don't know if this is true because she may have made it up so it'd be a stronger story, but she says, "It was my first time that immediately creates empathy, because now we are worried about her ability to do this. We empathize with people we worry about who are in jeopardy, and she now has put a lot at stake because she wants to do well, and this is it. And also, as we go through into the story, we see that what she will discover is this defendant that she's the expert witness about is most likely not guilty of what he's accused of, which makes her, now she has an opportunity to become heroic, and it adds more pressure, more at stake, more jeopardy for that character. So she's an everyday person, and we don't feel like she's telling this story to seem, oh, I'm so much smarter than you. In fact, as you will see, or those of you know who've read it, she ends up failing. This is a story about when she failed to achieve the goal and what she learned from that. So she creates empathy, she introduces us to her everyday life, and she gives herself a goal immediately, and now we are rooting for her to accomplish that goal.
And certainly all speakers, you're going to talk about your life experience, just as if you were writing for a speech for somebody, has to be their life experience. What I mean by you can't be the hero, if you are a multimillionaire, if you're a titan of industry, if you are a Hall of Fame keynote speaker, if you are whatever it is you've accomplished, it's important to let the audience know, and you very much did a great job explaining the backstory, that you didn't always know it. So it's either the people who supported you or the principles that you incorporated that are actually the heroes of you on your journey.
Yeah,
because obviously we're all the experts in our own life experience.
Yeah, by your definition, the hero is a mentor, it's the guide, it's the person with the pearl of wisdom, the person who provides what Craig Valentine calls the cure.
Yes.
In the other story, or that we provided for people, this is a speech by Rod Thorne. He does something somewhat different. He tells a series of stories. It's much more autobiographical. It's longer, and he weaves many stories through it. But the first one he tells is about an incident that occurred as a child with his mother. And he says, at a certain point in that story, he says, what my mother says next is not as much advice as it is a commandment. Words have the power to hurt and heal. If you want to live a life that matters and become a person that people can trust, you will use your words as a force for good. Now think how much more accessible that is, how much more we care about the speaker, the speechmaker, Rod Thorne, because he didn't say, let me tell you something. This is what I know. Words can hurt. No, he gave the wisdom to his mother. He gave the guidance to someone else and says, I want to share with you what they shared with me. It takes his ego out of it and actually makes him more empathetic and more of a kind of a stumbling everyday person like we all are, and gave someone else the heroic words that are going to help change him.
Yes, I always tell my clients and my students, yes, give the best lines to your character rather than pulling out the wisdom and delivering it as if, you know, you are the authority. So I hope everyone can see that what Hollywood has to teach us and what Michael will help Will Smith understand is exactly the same in writing or delivering speeches yourself. Well, Paul, let's ask the next poll, and the next poll question is,
what is the main challenge you face that prevents you from including more story elements in your speeches? And while I'm putting up that poll, Mike had a question for you. He asks about the transition from here's the opportunity to I seize the opportunity, what Blake Snyder calls the debate, and thinks that we need to spend more time on that struggle. What do you think?
Can you say that a little more slowly? Because he said Blake Snyder calls. Just say it again if you would, because I didn't quite understand the question.
Sorry about that. He's basically, Blake Snyder calls the here's the opportunity transition to I seize the opportunity, the debate, and thinks that we need to spend more time on that struggle of transitioning from one to the other. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. The term I use for it is the new situation. When your hero is given an opportunity, that's just simply the first new event that occurs. So in the rap music or the rap defendant in the trial story, the opportunity was getting the call from the DA. Or in that case, the defense attorney, and in the other story, or the first story in the series, that Rod Thorne was telling, his friends come to him, or the kids that he looks up to at school, and say, we've got something important to show you. These are 7 important words. So now the hero moves into this new situation and has to decide, what am I going to do about this? Now it may be a struggle, it may be easy, it may not be that difficult, but they have to answer the questions of, what are the rules in this new world I've entered? What am I going to have to know? What are the tools at my disposal? So the attorney goes and starts reading the case, and she says at first it seemed like he was guilty. And the kid, when Rod Thorne was a kid, he goes with the other kid and starts writing down these words, not knowing what they are. But it is only when the hero comes to a goal. For Rod Thorne, it was, I've got to show my mother these words, and for the attorney, it's, now I've got to go testify in the trial and show them why he's innocent, that they have that visible goal. So it's kind of a gap between the opportunity and finally moving toward that visible finish line.
Wonderful. All right, Paul, do we have an answer to the poll? Tell everyone the questions and what the percentage was.
Absolutely. The question, once again, is what is the main challenge you face that prevents you from including more story elements in your speeches? 44% said lack of ideas and inspiration. 28% said topic not suitable for stories. 13% was a tie, lack of time, and audience just wants to hear facts. And then at 3%, the speaker was not willing to include personal stories in the speech.
Well, Ian, would you think that it's more your Silicon Valley speech writers than the speakers who say topics are not suitable for stories, or the audience wants to hear facts?
That's a very good question, Fripp. I believe, in my own experience at some of the larger Silicon Valley companies, there is a sort of a, I want to say macho, because it often applies to women as well, equally, but a technical or a technological bias to very fact-based product intros or announcements, even employee communications, tends to be, and it's mainly, or it's somewhat attributable to the love of PowerPoint. Unlike speakers in the political arena and effective speakers in groups like the National Speakers Association, most of the speakers in Silicon Valley tend to use PowerPoint. They tend to load those PowerPoints up, with the exception of people like Steve Jobs, of course, who he was alive with Super for, telling great stories about his products. But there is that bias to fact. And I've had examples of executives who say, you know, this, I don't want to tell a story, this isn't about me. Now, I wasn't pitching it as elegantly as Michael explained, where they probably thought it doesn't want to be about me. I wasn't able to maybe make that leap to it being about somebody else being the hero. So, net it out, I think there is a bias towards facts in this industry.
Well, I remember one of my favorite clients who was the president of a $2 billion software company, and they had a big meeting with for 1,500 salespeople, and 40% of them had been acquired, so it was really important. They're bringing 1,500 people from around the world to the Bellagio in Las Vegas, and they wanted everyone to know you're with the right company at the right time and the strategy is sound. And you can imagine how many millions this meeting was costing them. Yeah. And when I worked with all the other managers and executives, and they asked me to work with the president, and the actual request was, we don't have any corporate rock stars. Our president is not a bad speaker. He's not a bad speaker at all, but he's an engineer. He's shy. We want you to turn him into a corporate rock star. Can you do that? And you got 4 hours. Well, it was so much fun. But as I was going through that, he was talking about strategy, and I said, when was the first time you realized the importance of strategy? And he talked about when he was a 14-year-old ball boy before the French Open, and his best friend was equally matched, and their ball boy was a girl. It was his friend's sister was trying to sabotage the game in favor of her brother, the way she threw the balls. And he said that was the first time I learned the importance of strategy. And the question he asked, Ian, is what you hear all the time, and your speech writers, do they want to hear this story? And of course the answer is yes. And my reasoning and what I teach, and this is in this case history is in the leadership presentations in Fripp VT, and I encourage my users to watch it or re-watch it, because what I said is, look, it's important for your 1,500 salespeople, especially the people who've never met you before, to see the person behind the position. Because you'll work hard for a company and the president, but when you know and like and have an understanding and you have a confidence if you know this man has been studying strategy since he was 14. So Michael, what would you say in that situation to that executive if they were getting pushed back to the speechwriter?
Well, assuming the speechwriter has some influence and can have a conversation, I might do a few things. One is I might ask them, can you remember a speech you saw that was great? And can you remember a speech you saw that bored you to tears? And ask them, did either of them have stories in it? And if they can't remember, go online, go to YouTube where there's 60 billion things, and find speeches, one with a story, one without, and show them, say, take 5 minutes to tell me which one you like better. And see if they can't just come to the conclusion themselves, yeah, that's it. I think the resistance is not just, yes, that's a picture of data and so on, but I think part of the problem, and I bet anything, Patricia, some of the Fripp VT people are sort of to storytelling as well, is there's a fear of it. It's like, I don't know how to do this rock home tour, it sounds complicated, I might embarrass myself. And I think part of it is you just have to convince them that it's not rocket science. It's honestly tell about yourself and where you were. Say something that occurred to you, like the ball girl. Say what out of that event did you want, and what were the obstacles you overcame. And even if you mumble and bumble through that, if you say, doors for things. Oh, and I should have done the last thing. And how were you different at the end? Just give us those 5 things, and try it out. If you're a speech writer, you might even go so far as to say, okay, I wrote these 3. Here's 2. And read them both. Which one you think might be better, and make the story part of it pretty simple and straightforward and rudimentary, and not a great portion of it because you're trying to get somebody who's never done it before. But yeah. I think anything you can do to get them to realize how much more emotionally involving a speech is and how unemotional data is going to move them off their gun.
All right, good. Now, certainly in Hollywood, in some of the heroes or the protagonists or certainly the characters within movies aren't likable. I mean, they're gangsters, they're thugs, or they're not nice people, yet we sit in, and we have empathy for them. For example, in The Godfather, I mean, you found yourself rooting for some of these characters, and they were terrible people. So what do you say to that, Michael?
Oh, I'm so glad you chose The Godfather, and I didn't set you up to this. I didn't ask you about that. To me, the best American movie ever. But it's a very instructive story, because if you read The Godfather, he doesn't start out as a horrible person. Now, it's a tragedy about someone who goes through a downward spiral, but when we first meet Michael, what do we learn about him? He's a war hero. He announces that my family has nothing to do with me. He treats Kay, his girlfriend at the time, very well. He loves his family, but he doesn't have anything to do with them. And then he's drawn in this situation when his father was shot, and his motives are not to be a criminal, not to deal drugs or politicians or any of that corrupt stuff. He wants to protect his family. But at the beginning of the story, he is presented as an everyday person who is quite empathetic. Now, to go further with The Godfather, in some stories you're right. You start right out with someone, say Jack Nicholson, as good as it gets, who starts really throwing a dog down a garbage chute. And you would say, but here is how to create empathy. Empathy is not synonymous with likability. Likeable character will be empathetic, perhaps, but also empathize with people who we feel sorry for, who are the victim of some undeserved misfortune. Let me take us back to one of the stories that we use as an example. In Rod Thorne's speech, in his first story, he says, to begin, I ask you to travel back in time with me about 45 years and step into the trailer I grew up in. It's a used New Moon Hallmark, 10 feet wide by 40 feet long. It's on a dirt road way out in the country in upstate New York. My mother and father are very poor. Now, look what he does there. First of all, he draws us into the new world with details and a clear picture of this. You can picture this trailer on this dirt road. But he also, everything he says creates sympathy for him, because we feel sorry for this family living in this crime trailer on a dirt road. They're very poor. And all of that is to get us to empathize with that character, in this case himself, as a child, before we find out anything about his personality. Just we feel sorry for him. And then, when he's victimized by the boys in the story that come in next, that creates more sympathy. Jeopardy is the other way, as I said, with the rap star, the rap trial. She introduces it by saying, first case, got the evidence home, looked at what this defendant had written, because he's accused of being a terrorist based on some note they found in his car. And she will conclude that that note is just rap lyrics. He wasn't trying to hurt anybody, he was just making up a song. But because they found it in his car and he's black and they found that he owned a gun, they were leading that way. But she said, when I first looked at the note, I thought this guy must be guilty. So now we know she wants to help this guy, but he looks dead on guilty. So she's in great danger of losing the thing that's important to her, her standing, success in this, and so on. So jeopardy, sympathy, likability, and one last way is humor. That's why we empathize with Jack Nicholson in As Good as It Gets. He's just hilarious. And people are funny, especially people who have the courage to be politically incorrect, as he does, are oftentimes the object of empathy, because we like kind of identifying with somebody saying, oh, I could never say that out loud, but I think it's very funny. So there are more paths to empathy than just likability.
All right, good. And when you're telling a story and you're about to introduce your hero or your protagonist, how do you suggest some of the best approaches for speakers or writers to do that?
Well, the main thing, and this is a critical part of story that's often forgotten, actually, and that is we must meet your hero living her everyday life before she's plunged into these extraordinary circumstances. Because a good story, among many other things, is like a before and after picture. There's always going to be something that changes in the course of the story. And if we don't know how the hero was at the beginning or what the world was like at the beginning, then we're not going to have anything to compare it to when we get to the end of the story. So as in both of these, I already pointed out, it's a kid living in a trailer park, some older boys that he looks up to that sort of bully him and tease him. It's a woman who's a criminologist but has never been an expert witness before, who's given a seemingly impossible case to present evidence for. So we know who they are before the train leaves the station, so to speak. So it's show us the character, living her everyday life, and use those tools, I said, to create empathy, and then present that character with that first opportunity that's going to get the story moving forward. And those things are really all you need to do. And it can be very quickly. I mean, that story about the trial, all it is 2 sentences. This is who I was, and I got this call that they wanted me to do that. And we know everything we really need to know about her.
Good. Paul, why don't we see, are there any questions that people have sent in?
Let's take a look. Excuse me. And well, there's one thing that there's a little bit of an echo. So if when one person isn't speaking, if the person who's not speaking could mute the microphone just to cut back on the echo a bit, and we'll go over that later.
All right, good.
And there was some questions. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. If there are more questions, good.
Well, Carrie mentioned something about that she has an issue with time restraints with speeches, and she usually has an elevator speech under 2 minutes, and I believe she was asking on tips to maximize that time. It was from what you were talking about earlier.
Did the person say if they want to incorporate a story into a 2-minute speech? Is that the idea?
Yes.
It can be done. I mean, I wrote a whole book on pitching scripts, and it's about conveying the highlights of a screenplay that's 120 pages in 60 seconds.
Give us some examples. Yes.
Yeah, it has to be a very, very brief story. You have to cut out some of these details, but it could be as simple as I knew a person, or once I was in this situation and I found out I had to X. I had no idea how to do that until someone told me this. And with that piece of wisdom or that tool, or I work a lot with internet marketers. They're trying to sell products or processes or systems and so on. And they say, this is the situation the person was in. They then bought my product or bought my process or signed up for it or whatever. And then this is where they were at the end of that. So it can be done very quickly as long as you hit hero, opportunity, goal, conflict, and then show us where they were at the end. It's not as easy. It's just hit those key beats and incorporate it into the slightly bigger speech, and you can still make it work. I hope that answers that question.
All right. Paul, other questions?
Not right now. There is a comment. Mike said that Selling Your Story in 60 Seconds was a great book and he enjoyed it.
All right, good.
Thank you. Thanks for saying that.
Now, I understand when you're listening to Michael, you don't always want to be distracted sending in questions. However, if you do, and as Paul always says, short and specific is good. And so Paul, what is the next polling question?
The next polling question is, let's see here, sorry about that. What has been your biggest challenge in adapting true stories into speech?
Okay. All right, and the choices are?
Narrowing the scope of a story and finding what to focus on, deciding which of many stories to choose from, and making the story relevant for your audience.
All right. Well, we'll give you a minute or so to look at that and answer. And meanwhile, let's go back to Ian for a second. And based on listening to Michael, and I know you listened to him in person when we both spoke for the National Speakers Association in Northern California, are there any questions you would like to ask on behalf of speech writers in general?
Well, thanks a lot. I think for the purposes of this conversation, one thing I actually heard it from you first, because you were the first person in the speaking world many years ago I heard refer to script writing and Hollywood as a source of inspiration or a source of formulas and vehicles that we can incorporate into public speaking. And you mentioned, and I don't know, I'm sure it's something Michael and you must have discussed, the whole question of an inciting incident, which apparently is phenomenally important in the world of movies. Is this concept of an inciting incident also applicable to speeches, Michael?
Well, if I can say a couple of words and then Michael will go in. Because if you look at the Fripp speech diagram, which you all are very familiar with, you can print them out from your file vault, and the Fripp VT, we have a lot on structure. But the opening, the first 30 seconds of speech and the last 30 have the most impact. And when you introduce the premise of your speech, in other words, you're going from your opening story or engagement into what they're going to be learning, I compared the premise to the inciting incident. Right. So Michael, now tell everyone about the inciting incident and how long before in a movie that doesn't drag you have to get there.
Okay. First sort of a cautionary note. One of the most difficult things in studying story, I suppose it's difficult in studying anything, is there are a whole gaggle of us that are supposed experts, and we all like to develop our own jargon so we can separate ourselves. The dilemma that creates is Sid Field refers to inciting incident, as does Bob McKee. These are both associates of mine and big names in the screenwriting guru world. They mean different things by that term. What Bob McKee means by it is very close to what I mean by the opportunity. And someone else, I just read another book that I'm writing the foreword to, he calls it the hook. And so don't get too caught up in that term. The underlying principle is this, that something needs to happen fairly soon in a story to get the story going, to present this character with some new, what I call opportunities. Something has to happen that's going to turn the story in a new direction and is going to transport that character out of the world they're used to and into the world they're not. Out of the world of being a criminologist and into the world of I've got to be a witness in a courtroom. Out of the world of living in a trailer park and into the world of big kids who I think are trying to help me but who are not going to. So that's the principle you need to look for in story terms. It's not to skip over the everyday life, but as soon as you establish what that everyday life is and use one or more of those tools to establish empathy, then something better happen to get this thing going. In a movie, to answer your question, Patricia, in a well-written script, it's going to be 10% of the way into the movie. And if everybody goes and rents their favorite Hollywood movie and looks at the timer on the DVD player, I promise, 10%, 1% either side maybe, you'll find that event.
And if you are listening to a presenter who has an hour presentation and 20 minutes in, they are still telling you about what they're going to be telling you, they do not have a well-constructed speech. Now, of course, in the speaking world, I am probably best known for structure, how to organize in a logical way. And I was on a luncheon program with another Hall of Fame keynote speaker. And his speech was called the four pillars of success or the 4 pillars of something. And I think he was too relaxed, and the audience was laughing and responding. So at 50 minutes into his speech, he introduces the second pillar. Now, I'm thinking, well, of course I noticed this, nobody else will. Well, you always find out what people really think when you're at the cocktail party at the end of that day's conference and they've had a couple of drinks. And I was at sort of the organizer and committee party, about 50 people, and I wandered around because I was speaking the next day. Oh, what do you think of the speaker? And one person said, well, you know, he was quite good, but I don't think they gave him enough time. And I think, well, why? Well, did you notice it was 10 minutes before he had to finish when he introduced the second pillar? So the lay audience, they do know something is wrong. So the point is, this is a well-written speech. Even if, I'm not saying it's scripted, but you open well. You introduce the opportunity or the premise or the big idea or whatever they're going to learn or whatever you want to call it. Then what are the 3 or 4 ideas, talking points that prove your premise, that get your point across? Do your review, answer questions, close on a high. It's a good structure, just as a movie has a script. And isn't it true, Michael? The average Hollywood movie is the 3-act formula.
Yeah, that's a debate about that, but basically any well-structured movie can be divided into 3 acts. The approach I take to structure in movies is 6 stages, which is just every act has 2 stages within it. I don't want to get caught up in that for speaking because Hollywood is very rigid. Hollywood is a highly, highly structured, formulaic way of telling stories. But the beats are the same. You introduce everyday life, you introduce the hero, create empathy, everyday life, something happens. Out of that, the hero figures out a goal and they start pursuing it. They face a series of obstacles. If it's a short story, 1 major obstacle, and then there's a resolution to that, the climax, and then, and we haven't touched on that, but I'll introduce it now, the other side, the after picture, is what I call the aftermath. And here's what I mean by that, that whenever you tell a story, we need to see the new life the character is now living, having completed the journey. Now, if anything related to sales is involved, and you're telling a story, or let's say you're a speaker wanting to be hired as a consultant, and you're telling a story to one of your clients, it's critical that at the end of that story you say, and now that client is a very successful speaker in some way. Specifically, if it was you, Patricia, trying to promote your coaching, or now that person's a millionaire, or now that person is happy in a relationship, or whatever. If it's a story like the rap artist who was accused of being a terrorist, and she had lost the case, she could not persuade the jury, and he goes to jail, the aftermath was an innocent man is in prison, and she used that to get to the bigger meaning of the speech, the theme of the speech, and that is we need to take a closer look at how another aspect of racism might be infiltrating our justice system, because rap lyrics are introduced into trials frequently, and country music, no other form of music, including heavy metal, are the lyrics ever used as a basis for convicting someone. And so she's making a bigger point by showing the aftermath of losing the trial and now turning that into an opportunity to do better. So you have to have that tail end of the story. You can't end and the hero achieved the goal. Any questions? That's not a good story. They achieved the goal, and now here is the new life they're living. And here's the new life you can live, is the implication if you find the same kind of courage that character.
And certainly in sales presentations, and certainly if you have not revisited it recently, the Fripp VT on sales presentations, and the formula we use, which is very much the same. What is the situation? One of your clients had the same problem that your prospect has. And it's very important you use dialogue, use the words, and I would challenge all my salespeople, and again in Fripp VT you will find it, if your client could articulate it, if they had said help, how would they have articulated in a short, clear, concise way what their problem was? And then of course then you talk about the solution, what you help them with, and of course the aftermath, or what I call the success in a story, is how the client is better off because of whatever product or service they had. So I hope our listeners are understanding there is a lot to learn when you go to the movies. And I recommend everybody, you can write off your theater tickets. You can write off the movie tickets if you are interested in speaking, because you look for what are the principles. Because principles are universal. And as my brother Robert Fripp says, the principles in any one discipline are exactly the same principles in another discipline. And he is, of course, a musician and famous, a rock star, Robert Fripp, frequent collaborator with his sister on speeches. Now, Ian, if you were going to give us a snapshot of what a speech writer in Silicon Valley knows, so we've got how Michael structures a screenplay, how Fripp would recommend people structure a speech. I always look at a screenplay is the Fripp's speech structure laying on its side. So what's your snapshot of writing a screenplay? Then we'll look at the poll that we ask people to participate in.
Well, I'd agree wholeheartedly with the suggestions both you and Michael made about the importance of structure. I mentioned earlier that many of the speeches in Silicon Valley involve PowerPoint. And one of the people I like to quote in that world, well, there's two actually, Nancy Duarte, whose Duarte Design Company is one of the premier creative agencies in this world, has written a fantastic book called Resonate, where she talks about the visual display of information on PowerPoint or keynote slides, and she's got some very good tips in there. Another person is Guy Kawasaki, who's well known he originally was an Apple evangelist. He's now kind of a phenomenon in his own right, who has written many books on many topics and presents in an excellent way himself. And he has a formula, I don't quite remember the exact formula, but it's like 10 by 20 by 30, and I think it's 10 slides at least 20-point font in no more than 30 minutes. I might have got that wrong, but I think there's a structure to the visual display of information that certainly in the world where presenters need to include PowerPoint is important. But I'm fascinated to hear, though, what is the results of that latest poll?
Okay, Paul, tell us what our listeners said.
The biggest challenge in adapting true stories into speech was 68% says making the story relevant for your audience.
Well, if I may, I will just throw out a couple of suggestions of some scripting lines, and then we'll hand it over to Michael. And then I know after that your answer, Michael, I know a lot of our listeners think, oh, I want more of this, so we'll bring up the slides and show people what they could find if they went to your website. But a lot of this is your introductory lines. Perhaps you can relate. What would you have done in this situation? So, because what you want to do, you're telling a story from your life experience. However, you want to emotionally connect and take them with you. A great opening line as well is imagine. Whenever you say the word imagine, and of course pause for a few seconds, the audience knows you are now going to take them to a different time and place. However, you are the star of this event, Michael, so tell us how you would answer that.
Well, my answer would be a question to ask yourself if you're speaking yourself or if you're writing a speech, and that is, what does your audience want or need? In other words, it's not enough to say, well, this is an audience of engineers, I'm going to tell a story about an engineer. You have to think, what do they want to take away from this? Now, they may be there under duress because they had to be, but then say, what if they could take it away would make them really appreciate this? It could be something concrete. It could be something more personal or inside, more a transformative kind of thing, and I'll touch on that in a second. But then what you want to do is look for a story where the hero of the story accomplished a goal that is either similar to a goal the audience would have, or at least took them to a place or changed them in a way that the audience would like to change. So, for example, let's say you're speaking to a group of salespeople, and you were to tell a story. The hero of that story is someone who succeeded at selling something to someone who's a very difficult customer using a technique that might be the theme of your bigger speech. But I think what's relevant to the audience is going to be whatever it is that is going to transform them as they sit and listen to this speech. It's going to make them feel differently, and even better, make them feel better about themselves, or as in the rap on trial speech, send them out of that theater fired up about changing a situation in society, because that was really her goal. It was relevant to the society. She made it relevant not because they're rap stars, not because they're lawyers, not because that's a part of their existence, but because they are citizens, and she broadened the theme into something we all have to face, and that is our justice system still contains racist elements that we need to look at and confront, and so she inspired them to want to take action. But it's always about how do you want them to leave the theater or the screen if it's something on TV or whatever it might be. And I want to touch on one more thing I said about just this issue of transformative speeches. The most powerful speeches to me, or the most powerful stories to me, are the ones where the character actually has an arc. It's not just about, yes, I faced these obstacles and I overcame them, but it's something where the character transforms. Those are the speeches that will also help your audience transform. But to understand how to do that, you need to understand a couple other things. I'll throw in some of my jargon again before anybody else's jargon can take its place. To understand about transformative story, first you need to know that a character who's going to have an arc needs to start the story with what I call a wound. Something in the past that happened to that character that caused a level of pain that they've never fully processed. They've either pushed it away or they've said they've dealt with it, but they hadn't. But some source of pain in the past that created in that person a fear. And that fear is now affecting how they behave. Now, there isn't so much an arc in the rap on trial speech. That's more about I learned this, which is a kind of transformation. She thought she could convince a jury and then she couldn't. But it's more about how society needs to change. But there's a wonderful example of this in the speech by Rod Thorne. Now, Rod Thorne's speech is not like a movie. It's more like a TV series. It's a longer speech, and he weaves stories all through it. So you have to sort of parse out each story he tells. But the first story is going to echo back at the end. Because in the first story, he says, I want to read this. Besides the message from his mother, he very clearly paints a wound. And that wound was the 7 words that his bully friends tried to get him to do were George Carlin's 7 words you couldn't say on TV. In other words, they were teaching him how to swear. And his mother was quite upset. His mother takes him to the helm of the kid who, the gang leader who did this, confronted that boy's mother and says, these are the words your son told me, these are the words your son told my son to say. And the mother turned to her son and he said, I don't know what they're talking about. And so the other boy's mother slammed the door in his face. Now, he didn't identify it as such, but it's a great wound, because what happened is he experienced this as, he turned this into a belief, and that is, people are always going to look down on me and get the best of me because we're poor. And if anybody finds out that I'm poor, then I won't be able to persuade them to do something. Then he goes on to be a grown-up, and he's a consultant and an assistant and a CEO and advisor to high-level people in politics and industry. But he says at one point, before I go on in the speech, I'd like to say something that's very hard for me to admit. Back on that corporate jet, he has told a separate story about meeting a corporate leader on his own jet and how affluent it was and so on. And he says, back on that corporate jet, staring into my laptop, there was a very big part of me that does not believe I belonged in such rare air. In fact, I feel it right now. And so he has now woven through all the individual stories in this speech this underlying idea that deep down, I was wounded in this way, being a poor kid who saw my mother have a door slammed in her face. And I have always struggled with the fear that I don't belong here. And his speech is actually a lesson in how you confront that fear and how you overcome that fear. And that's by, instead of worrying about what your status is, becoming what his mother said, becoming someone others can trust. And so the theme of the speech becomes this arc, this transformation, this fear overcome made universal. And those to me are the deepest, most meaningful, most impactful stories. The ones where a character changes and then we feel we can change in the same way.
And Michael also says at the end of the talk, as I remember, that the value he brings to the corporate jet world is that he represents the people they're flying over, which I thought was a wonderful phrase he put in at the end to explain the value he has representing the everyman to those corporate executives.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that, and realizing that all the corporate executives basically have the same fear. We all believe we're faking it and someday we're going to get caught. We all have those moments, which is how he made this a universal speech, how he thought about what does this audience want or need to hear on a deeper level. And that's how he would answer that question that was asked in the poll, I think.
All right, and Paul, if you could now bring up, because I know people want to know about what's on Michael's website. We see it is storymastery.com, very beautiful website, and I do recommend that you certainly sign up for Michael's newsletter on stories, which is free and a great read and great ideas. And then you might... would on Story Mastery, where would they click to get the products we are now going to see?
Surprisingly, on a button that says products.
Yay! Yes.
So, yes, what I've tried to do with the website is provide just as much material as I can on different aspects of story. And again, it is movie dominant, but it's not just articles for movie writers. It's articles about the principles of story as they are used or exemplified by movies. So I have a number of people on the list who are speakers or internet marketers or attorneys or whatever. But if you just go to that website, surf around, start searching any topic you think might be good, you'll see a lot of articles that are there for the looking, and you'll see buttons almost everywhere that says sign up for my newsletter. And if you do, there's a premium. You get a list of key questions for speakers, and that's the one you'd probably want to pick, which is a list of like 20 questions you need to ask about any story that you're incorporating into a speech. And then if you go to products, we've mentioned some of these. The one in the middle of at the top of the screen, the Hero's Two Journeys, that's the DVD, or it's a streaming video now, of a lecture I gave with Chris Vogler. That's the video that Will Smith watched that made him want to pick up the phone. Writing Screenplays That Sell is self-explanatory. That was my first book on all that goes into writing a screenplay, and which would incorporate all of these principles pretty much I've been talking about as they apply to movies. Selling Your Story in 60 Seconds is about being able to convey the essence of a story in just a minute or two when you're trying to persuade somebody to read a script or a novel, but those elements, those key elements, are the same key elements that a speech would have. And finally, the what looks like business card on the bottom is a flash drive of a PowerPoint that I created, or a presentation, and there's also an audio version of it, plus some other goodies. It's what I consider the key principles of storytelling, but I specially geared it toward people who are not professional storytellers. It's not so much for novelists and screenwriters as it is for public speakers and internet marketers. So you can pick and choose from those, or read more about those on the website. And of course, there's also a way to contact us, because many of you may have more questions than we could answer. Just please, click Contact Michael, put your question in, and I'll do my best to answer it.
Good. And based on that, Paul, do we have any quick, short questions for Michael?
Yes, there's a question earlier from Dave. He says, is it okay to jump right into the hook, inciting incident, and then backtrack to the everyday life portion?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I didn't mention it, but the story I've been referring to, I don't know if Dave's had a chance to read it yet or not, about Rap on Trial, she starts out, the opening words are, I got a phone call. So she starts with the opportunity and then fills us in on what her background is. I'll give you one more tip. I think we have time for this. Sometimes a good way to start a story is actually in the middle. Start at a moment in the story where the hero of that story is facing a huge obstacle, and then leave us hanging about whether they'll be able to overcome that conflict, and go back and say, 5 days before that, I was happily in my den watching television when this happened, but all the time we're anticipating, but what's going to happen when you get back to that point? And then the story leads us back to that moment. Your hero overcomes the obstacle, and then you finish out the story. That works because that hook is much more emotional, because you start right out with a big conflict, and emotion goes out of conflict.
All right, good. Wonderful. Any more questions, Paul?
Not right now.
Okay, good. Well, in case you have not been to VT recently, or for any of Ian's friends who would like help understanding how to be powerful, persuasive, personable, and understand how to structure your presentations, connect to the audience, personalize your presentation, deliver webinars, any aspect of presentations in a highly interactive, learn at your own pace format, we will send you over to Fripp Virtual Training. In fact, Paul, if you can bring up Fripp VT so people would be very comfortable knowing what it looks like. And certainly it has been so much fun collaborating with Michael again and with Ian. And Michael, just while Paul brings up Fripp VT, I will be seeing you next in Las Vegas in November. Is that a conference other people can attend? Is that for romance writers?
Yes. The answer is yes and no. It will be open to the public, but it's sponsored by the Romance Writers of America chapter there. it will still include all the key principles of story, but they will be geared towards romance fiction as well as movies, because I always incorporate movies because that's where I get my principles. If they go to that website, if they go to my website and click on events or schedule or whatever it is, you'll see all the places I'm going to be speaking. I have quite a few out-of-town lectures coming up in the next 6 months. So including Silicon Valley, which is going to be early next year. And I don't remember the details right now, but for the Silicon Valley speakers, it will be posted on that website. And if you sign up for my newsletter, you'll get notified about it closer to the date.
Perfect. So, Paul, can you show Fripp VT? So if you have not been there, we recommend you go to Fripp VT. Paul, can you show them where the free trial is? Well, no, the free trial is in the middle, but okay, that's fine. But yeah, it will get here, so that's right. You sign up for a free trial, exactly, and then can you take us over to the courses so people can see what is there? Good, he's signing in as me. Good. So every time you click on select, and we'll just show you a snapshot of the courses of what's available. And this is the most action-packed. Oh dear, I forgot to turn my phone off. Okay, my brother's calling from Pershore, but I will get back to him. So this is, after all, you can see we're live, real live. This is not an edited show. But we would encourage everyone to go look at Fripp Virtual Training, take a trial, and hopefully join. And for those of you who, of course, are already my loyal members, we recommend that you are now inspired and you revisit the story chapter. So, Paul, if you can bring us back, we will, of course, send you over to Fripp VT. So from this meeting, you can go directly there and look around. So, Ian, what are your concluding remarks, and how would people find out about Silicon Valley speechwriters?
Well, our conclusion is this has been a wonderful hour and a quarter. I thank both you, Ms. Fripp, as well as Michael, for making yourselves available and sharing all this insight. It's priceless. For people who have a specific interest in speechwriting and would like to look at our archive of meetings that we've had, most of them haven't been this high-tech. Last time it was with you, but most of these are simple conference calls. I would just suggest you Google Silicon Valley Speechwriters Roundtable. It's a meetup group. We only meet virtually, mainly because Silicon Valley is so spread out. There's no way that people in San Jose are going to travel up to Marin or vice versa for meetings. So we meet online, typically a phone call about 6 times a year, no charge to join, and you can find other speechwriters to talk with. We occasionally post job postings and so on. Everybody's welcome, no matter where you are in the world. If you've got an interest in speechwriting in Silicon Valley, we'd love to have you. And again, thank you to both of you for joining in. And Ms. Fripp, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Good, and certainly if you are in the Bay Area and would like to come to the event, it is only $45 for a 4-hour event at South San Francisco Conference Center called Stand Up, Speak Out, and Cash In. WWW.NSA, which stands for National Speakers Association, NC, Northern California.org, and it will leap out of the page. And yes, you can register even now. For our Fripp VT user meeting, the next call will be in the beginning of October, I believe, with Joanne Black, who is the author of No More Cold Calls. And as you well know, the last words linger. Make them count. So, Michael, what is your walk-away pithy remark to close our program?
This is the downside of sharing the stage with Patricia. She tosses lobs for an hour and a half and then puts me on the spot at the very end. I want to say, too, first of all, I want to say thanks, and I do hope to hear from everyone. Go to my website. If I could ever work with you one-on-one, I'd love to. There's information on my coaching there. But as far as what we've been talking about, I would say this. Don't be story phobic, and don't let the people you're writing speeches for be story phobic. You may need to start them in easily. Just concentrate on everyday people with clear, visible goals who face big obstacles and then are able to overcome them by finding courage. That's really the essence of a great story. Stay focused on that, and your stories will always be better. So thank you again to both of you, Patricia and Ian.
Well, thank you. And Paul, of course, thank you for being our moderator. Thank you for being our loyal supporters, for attending this meeting. And with that, it's a wrap.